This is possibly the most terrifying news that the US has had to digest in a long time. Now, it's terrifying for a couple reasons. This article is about informal discussions that the US military is having around potentially controversial orders. Now, we're going to be going into what some of those controversial orders might be in a moment, and we've already talked about some terrifying military scenarios in the past on US soil on this channel. One actually becoming a reality when Japanese American families were rounded up and detained in undisclosed locations for undetermined amounts of time during World War II. And before we get into this article, this is one thing I want everyone to keep in mind. This is the US military discussing either controversial military exercises that may be conducted on US soil by the US military, and or this is top US military leaders informally talking about how they may directly disobey these orders and disrupt the US chain of command. And essentially this would be the US military taking control of the executive branch to prevent a military state. And the mental gymnastics there is astounding, but either way, it is equally terrifying. And the reason I want to bring this up is because everyone needs to know that this is a huge signal for where we are right now. The US chain of command being disrupted by the US military because of politics. Let me repeat, this is the US chain of command being disrupted by the US military because of politics. And this goes back to continuity of government, and this goes back to Counterinsurgency, Field Manual 3-24, like we've been discussing on this channel, and this goes back to national emergency powers by the US military. And this is where political instability and political violence leads to military intervention. Keep that in mind. The military will put the Constitution aside under national security imperatives for the sake of continuity of government. So again, this is the US military discussing either controversial military exercises that may be conducted on US soil by the US military, and or this is top US military leaders informally talking about how they may directly disobey these orders and disrupt the US chain of command. Essentially, this would be the US military taking control of the executive branch to prevent a military state. Both equally frightening and ethically concerning for democracy. So with that, let's get into it. Pentagon officials discussing how to respond if Trump issues controversial orders. And this article just came out November 8th, 2024. Pentagon officials are holding informal discussions about how the Department of Defense would respond if Donald Trump issues orders to deploy active duty troops domestically and fire large swaths of apolitical staffers, defense officials told CNN. Trump has suggested he would be open to using active duty forces for domestic law enforcement and mass deportations, and has indicated he wants to stack the federal government with loyalists and, quote, clean out corrupt actors, end quote, in the U.S. national security establishment. Trump, in his last term, had a fraught relationship with much of his senior military leadership, including now retired General Mark Milley, who took steps to limit Trump's ability to use nuclear weapons while he was chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The president-elect, meanwhile, has repeatedly called U.S. military generals, quote, woke, end quote, weak, end quote, and, quote, ineffective leaders. Officials are now gaming out various scenarios as they prepare for an overhaul of the Pentagon. Okay, now let me step away from this article just to explain that to you. When they say gaming out various scenarios, what are they talking about? Gaming out, what does that even mean? These are war games. They're wargaming various scenarios as they prepare for an overhaul of the Pentagon. It's frightening. No matter for what reason or no matter what outcome, that is frightening. Wargaming various scenarios on US soil. All right, now let's get back to the article. Quote, we are preparing and planning for the worst case scenario, but the reality is that we don't know how this is going to play out yet, end quote, one defense official said. Trump's election has also raised questions inside the Pentagon about what would happen if the president issued an unlawful order, particularly if his political appointees inside the department don't push back. Quote, troops are compelled by law to disobey unlawful orders, end quote, said another defense official. Quote, but the question is, what happens then? Do we see resignations from senior military leaders, or would they view that as abandoning their people, end quote. Now, I want to step away from this for one more moment. These are all extremely ethical, concerning issues that are arising from politics and that are arising from our own system. So these are very serious questions that the defense community is taking into account here. So I want everybody to realize that this isn't, oh, the military is just going to disobey Trump, or, oh, Trump's going to do this so the military has to. This is about military intervention because of politics. So just keep that in mind, no matter which side of that line you fall on. This is extremely concerning for democracy and for the Constitution. So just keep that in mind. And let's get back into the article. It's unclear at this point who Trump will choose to lead the Pentagon, though officials believe Trump and his team will try to avoid the kind of, quote, hostile, end quote, relationship he had with the military during his last administration, said a former defense official with experience during the first Trump administration. Quote, the relationship between the White House and the Department of Defense was really, really bad. And so I know it's top of mind for how they're going to select the folks they put into the Department of Defense this time around, end quote, the former official said. Defense officials are also scrambling to identify civilian employees who might be impacted if Trump reinstates Schedule F, an executive order he first issued in 2020 that, if enacted, would have reclassified huge swaths of non-political career federal employees across the U.S. government to make them more easily fireable. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin said on Tuesday that, quote, I totally believe that our leaders will continue to do the right thing no matter what. I also believe that our Congress will continue to do the right thing in support of our military, end quote. And this section is titled The Enemy from Within. Top of mind for many defense officials is how Trump plans to wield American military power at home. Trump last month said that the military should be used to handle what he calls, quote, the enemy from within, end quote, and, quote, radical left lunatics, end quote. Quote, I think it should be very easily handled by, if necessary, by National Guard, or if really necessary, by the military, because they can't let that happen again, end quote. He added, referring to potential protests on Election Day. Several former senior military officials who served under Trump have sounded the alarm in recent years about his authoritarian impulses, including Milley and retired General John Kelly, Trump's former White House chief of staff. Kelly said before the election that Trump fits, quote, into the general definition of fascist, end quote, and he spoke of the loyalty of Hitler's Nazi generals. There is not much the Pentagon can do to preemptively shield the force from a potential abuse of power by a commander-in-chief. Defense Department lawyers can and do make recommendations to military leaders on the legality of orders, but there is no real legal safeguards that would prevent Donald Trump from deploying American soldiers to police U.S. streets. Let's back up a little bit. People have to get this left-wing, right-wing thing out of their mind. When it comes to continuity of government, and the military feels that activities that are happening on U.S. soil may disrupt that, whether it be riots, whether it be insurgency, whether it be insurrection, whether it be political instability from trying to round people up to deport them, if this affects national security, quote, there is no real legal safeguard that would prevent Trump from deploying American soldiers to police U.S. streets, end quote. And it is for these national emergency powers that this is possible. So just keep that in mind. Let's get back to the article. A former senior Defense Department official who served under Trump said he believes it is likely that additional active duty forces will be tasked with assisting Customs and Border Protection at the southern border. There are already thousands of forces at the border, including those with active duty, National Guard, and the reserves. The Biden administration sent 1,500 active duty forces last year and later sent several hundred more. But it is also possible, the former official said, that forces could be sent into American cities if asked to help with the mass deportation plan Trump mentioned repeatedly on the trail. Domestic law enforcement agencies, quote, don't have the manpower, they don't have the helicopters, the trucks, the expeditionary capabilities, end quote, that the military brings, he said. But he emphasized that the decision to send active duty forces into American streets cannot be taken lightly. Quote, you can never water that down. You can never say with a straight face that it's not a big deal. It is a big deal, end quote, the former senior official said. Quote, but it's the only way to address issues at scale, end quote. Separately, an Army official told CNN they could imagine a Trump administration ordering several thousand more troops to support the border mission, but warned it could hurt the military's own readiness to deal with foreign threats. The president's powers are especially broad if he chooses to invoke the Insurrection Act, which states that under certain limited circumstances involved in the defense of constitutional rights, a president can deploy troops domestically unilaterally. A separate law, the Posse Comitatus Act, seeks to curb the use of the military to enforce laws unless authorized by Congress. But the law has exceptions for rebellion and terrorism, which ultimately gives the president broad leeway in deciding if and when to invoke the Insurrection Act. Trump reportedly considered invoking the act in 2020 to quell protests after the death of George Floyd. Quote, if the city or state refuses to take the actions that are necessary to defend the life and property of their residents, then I will deploy the United States military and quickly solve the problem for them, end quote, he said at the time. This next section is titled Civilian Employees at Risk. In a video posted last year, Trump said if elected, he would, quote, immediately reissue my 2020 executive order restoring the president's authority to remove rogue bureaucrats. We will clean out all of the corrupt actors in our national security intelligence apparatus, and there are plenty of them, end quote. The Pentagon is already bracing for the policy change. Quote, my email has been inundated on this topic, end quote. One defense official said of Schedule F. Quote, definitely going to be a busy couple months, end quote. After Trump issued Schedule F the first time, late into his last term, the Pentagon and other federal agencies were tasked with making lists of which employees would be moved into that category. At the time, defense officials tried to include as few civilian employees as possible to limit the impact to the workforce, sources said. The department is making similar lists now. The Office of Personnel and Management issued a rule in April that aimed to strengthen guardrails protecting federal employees, but, quote, there are still ways a new administration could work around these protections, end quote, a defense official said, even if it might take several months to do so. Austin has warned repeatedly about the risk of political abuse of the military. In July, he said in a memo that it is, quote, necessary to secure the integrity and continuity of the civilian workforce by ensuring the Department of Defense career civilian employees, like their uniformed counterparts, are shielded from unlawful and other inappropriate political encroachments, end quote. He added that career civil servants are tasked with, quote, maintaining strict political neutrality, focused on loyalty to the Constitution and laws of the United States, end quote. And on Wednesday, he wrote in a message to the force that the U.S. military will obey only lawful orders. Quote, as it always has, the U.S. military will stand ready to carry out the policy choices of its next commander-in-chief and to obey all lawful orders from its civilian chain of command, end quote. He wrote, quote, you are the United States military, the finest fighting force on earth, and you will continue to defend our country, our Constitution, and the rights of all our citizens, end quote. In the State Department, Secretary Anthony Blinken said in an email to members of the workforce Friday that he will make clear to the incoming Trump administration that, quote, "you are all patriots," end quote. The message obtained by CNN acknowledged that, quote, "transitions can be periods of uncertainty that raise questions about what comes next for our work around the world, for the State Department itself, and for its peoples," end quote. It is a seemingly pointed message. The State Department saw some of its top career officials targeted as part of Trump's first impeachment, and there was a significant departure of career diplomats during the first Trump administration. And that's the end of that article. And it is extremely, extremely important, and that's something that should be concerning for people on the left and people on the right. And just know that everybody's bickering back and forth like an old married couple, not finding common ground. Just know that this is where political instability brings the United States. This is where political violence leads, is military intervention on U.S. soil.